What if the things you create no longer feel like yours? Marx argued that in a capitalist society, our own labor becomes something strange, almost hostile, standing against us rather than for us. But what does that mean? And why did he believe this sense of estrangement lay at the heart of modern life? In this video, we'll explore how Marx moved from describing alienation to revealing exploitation, the hidden force behind capitalism itself. That journey did not start in economics, but in his youth, shaped by the atmosphere of a continent restless with upheaval. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping note. If you enjoy what I'm doing, a like and subscribe would be really helpful. It goes a long way in keeping the channel going. And don't forget to drop a comment. I'd really love to know what you think. Karl Marx was born in Trier in 1818. Surrounded by the optimism of Enlightenment ideas, but overshadowed by the instability of 19th century Europe. His household valued education, reason, and the writings of philosophers who challenged superstition. Yet outside, the world was restless. Political revolutions rose and fell, religion faced scrutiny, and students debated philosophies that seemed to promise an entirely new way of living. For Marx, these tensions were not just the backdrop to his youth, but the very conditions that would shape his own path. His father, Heinrich, embodied the spirit of the Enlightenment. A lawyer who admired figures like Voltaire and Rousseau, he promoted tolerance, reason, and a belief in justice rooted not in tradition, but in rational law. At the Marx family's table, such discussions seemed natural, even liberating. However, Trier was still under the watchful eyes of censors, and intellectual freedoms often stopped at the page. Marx grew up keenly aware that freedom of thought was valued in theory, but risky in practice. This uneasy divide instilled in him a sensitivity to contradiction, a lesson that would remain with him throughout his intellectual life. When Marx left Trier to pursue further studies, first in Bonn and then in Berlin, he brought these tensions with him into classrooms and lecture halls. At German universities, learning was anything but a quiet experience. Students fought duels to defend honor, argued publicly, and wrestled with theories as if their lives depended on it. In Bonn, Marx started establishing himself in this noisy intellectual world. When he moved to Berlin, the environment became more rigorous. Professors gave sweeping accounts of how history developed, what it meant to be human, and where freedom might be found. For Marx, this was not just study. It was engaging in lively debates that extended across Europe. One figure dominated these debates: Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Although Hegel had died before Marx arrived in Berlin, his influence was everywhere, appearing in syllabi, during passionate dormitory discussions, and in cafes where students debated late into the night. Hegel believed that history advanced through conflict and reconciliation. Contradiction was not a failure, but a form of progress. Human freedom evolved gradually through this significant dialectic. For those trying to understand a turbulent world, Hegel's philosophy offered more than just abstract theory. It seemed like a strategy for making sense of ongoing change. But many young readers of Hegel were less content to admire the structure of his system and more compelled to push it further. Hegel insisted that philosophy's task was to scrutinize human consciousness, revealing where it failed to align with real-life conditions. This was the core of what later became known as critical theory. the belief that there is always a gap between how people perceive their world and how they actually experience it. To embrace Hegel meant not simply to repeat his conclusions, but to decide, should philosophy defend tradition, or should it challenge religion, politics, and the state itself? It was this decision that inspired the young Hegelians, a loose but energetic group of writers and students who welcomed Marx into their circle. Figures like Bruno Bauer promoted applying Hegel's dialectic directly against existing institutions. They contended that his later writings had maintained too much reverence for the monarchy and the church. What mattered now was to critique every authority. These were not mere salons. Pamphlets were composed in smoky cafes, read aloud to eager audiences, and often confiscated by the police. Students, only a few years older than Marx, debated aloud whether kings had any right to rule, or whether scripture could withstand the challenge of reason. One wrong pamphlet could threaten a career. One daring statement could draw suspicion from the state. Tension sharpened these discussions, and danger made them all the more compelling. In this climate, Marx faced a choice. On one side, there was the secure path of a scholar, producing dense commentaries, defending a thesis, and perhaps one day earning a professorship. He possessed the training, discipline, and ability to craft intricate arguments. Yet, the other path was more urgent and more perilous. The radical energy of his peers and the conviction that philosophy that served only itself was empty. The young Hegelians spoke of ideas not as puzzles to be solved, but as forces that could act upon the world. A cautious academic life remained possible, but with every passing debate, it grew less appealing to Marx. Bruno Bauer, in particular, influenced Marx's early development. Bauer consistently applied Hegel's dialectical method to religion, insisting that Christianity could not withstand genuine critique. To Marx and his peers, Bauer's lectures felt like explosions. What once seemed solid now appeared fragile under dialectical reasoning. Marx learned from Bauer, but he also began to see a limitation. Bauer and others dismantled religious belief with precision, but rarely questioned what material needs sustained those beliefs. Would removing faith from people undo the conditions that made them cling to it in the first place? Marx's dissatisfaction grew quietly but steadily, a sign that his thinking was starting to diverge. This moment was less about rejection than about recalibration. Imagine two paths, one that stays within the realm of pure ideas, chipping away at doctrine, language, and tradition. Another that asserts those doctrines only exist because of the life circumstances surrounding them. Marx was inclined toward the second. His upbringing fostered skepticism of superstition. His education introduced him to Hegel's grand vision of history through contradiction, and his peers encouraged fearless critique. Yet the underlying unease remained. What about the human beings whose daily struggles philosophy seemed to neglect? This unease did not diminish Marx's identity as a philosopher. If anything, it made him more restless. He retained the rigor of German philosophy, but he no longer wished to remain confined within its abstract debates. He had started to realize that philosophies do not drift untethered in the ether. They take shape in life, in streets, in social conflict. In study groups and coffee houses, Marx absorbed not only arguments, but also the stark realization that words have consequences. To criticize was already to act, however modestly. Such awareness marked the early cracks in his alignment with a conventional academic path. By the mid-1840s, Marx had laid the groundwork for his later transformation. He drew strength from his father's Enlightenment rationalism, structure from Hegel's dialectic, and boldness from Bauer and the young Hegelians. These influences convinced him that criticism could be more than mere commentary. It could act as a force. At this point, however, it was still the young Hegelians who wielded philosophy as a weapon, sharpening ideas in the belief that truth itself required confrontation. Marx had not yet developed his own distinct method, but signs of it were already evident. Later, in one of his most notable lines, he would state that the weapon of criticism cannot replace the criticism by weapons. This conviction did not come overnight, but those early years laid its foundation. As the debates in Berlin swirled, Marx began sensing that questions of consciousness and critique were only part of the story. Religion could be challenged, but what if the force behind religion was not belief itself, but the conditions that led people to believe? What if a critique that stops at ideas overlooks the deeper human reality beneath them? These questions stirred him restlessly and pointed him toward the next stage of his journey, where another thinker would push him further still. What if the divine was not the origin of humanity, but a creation of society itself? This was Ludwig Feuerbach's striking claim. Rather than God creating man, man created God. For Marx, coming from a world of abstract metaphysics and endless clashes with theology, this sounded almost like a thunderclap. Instead of looking to heaven for mysterious truths, Feuerbach pulled everything back down to earth. Religion was not a revelation of the divine, but a projection of human qualities mistaken for otherworldly powers. Love, justice, fear, hope. These were not gifts handed down, but elements of human life cast outward and venerated as gods. For Marx, shaped by the atmosphere of the young Hegelians, this was a revelatory experience. Ideas were no longer unearthly forces. They were mirrors of human existence itself. Feuerbach called this shift naturalism. He argued that philosophy should start not with spirit or reason, but with the fragile, embodied lives of people. You hungered because you were a living creature, not because a divine command caused hunger within you. You longed for warmth, dignity, or companionship, not because the heavens spoke, but because your own human nature drove you. Religion was simply a reflection of these drives, projected onto a God who seemed to embody them perfectly. By worshiping love, justice, or forgiveness in the figure of God, people were only unknowingly gazing at their own capacities. It was a mirror, distorted but powerful. Today, many might assume Marx was always a materialist because he later used ideas like historical materialism to describe his worldview. But at this early stage, Marx resisted that label. Materialism sounded too crude, too much like a philosophy about dead matter. Instead, influenced by Feuerbach, he preferred to speak of naturalism, a way of grounding thought in human life as lived, in real needs, and the push of physical, social existence. This distinction mattered. Feuerbach's naturalism provided Marx with his first means of stepping outside the clouds of Hegelian abstraction, although he would eventually move beyond it toward his own version of materialism. The promise of Feuerbach's insight sparked Marx, but doubts soon arose. If religion were simply a projection of human nature, what explained why people felt compelled to project it in the first place? Why did they lead such unfulfilled lives that they required distant gods to embody their hopes? Feuerbach had demonstrated that the image in the mirror was merely a reflection of reality. However, for Marx, this left the more profound mystery unresolved. What shaped the room around the mirror? Why was the reflection even necessary? Recognizing an illusion did not by itself diminish its influence. Here lay their divergence. Feuerbach regarded human essence as a fixed set of qualities, a common core of love, reason, or moral capacity. Marx disagreed. He believed that human essence was not an abstract collection of traits, but activity itself. People craft their lives through labor, exchange, cooperation, and struggle. They transform nature while also transforming themselves. Reducing religion to a misunderstanding of abstract qualities meant never questioning how labor, poverty, or exploitation drove people toward such beliefs. For Marx, critique had to shift from projection to production. The real question was not just what religion mirrored, but why circumstances initially led to those reflections. Think of it like this. Feuerbach's critics stood at the edge of a calm lake. They finally realized the shape shimmering on the surface was not divine, but their own reflection. That was an important step. But for Marx, the lake itself could not be taken for granted. He wanted to wade in, to ask how winds, depths, and flowing waters made the reflection shimmer as it did. Recognition was not enough. Transformation was required. The world was not just an image. It was something to work with, to change through practice. This marked a new chapter in Marx's thinking, where the concept of alienation began to assume a more prominent role. If religion were a form of projection, then people were alienating their own abilities, handing over what was theirs, and worshiping it as an external force. However, if conditions of dissatisfaction caused projection, then alienation did not originate in the mind. It started in actual lived experience, whether in fields, factories, or the routines of work and reliance. In this view, religion was not the fundamental issue. It was a symptom. The alienation went deeper, into the very way people worked and related to their own creations. From this point, you can see Marx repositioning philosophy. If ideas originate from conditions, then critique must examine those conditions. The groundwork mattered more than the sky. Production, property, labor. These were no longer peripheral issues. They were the foundations of human life. Alienation was not merely symbolic, it was material. This realization directed Marx away from pure philosophy and towards economics and politics, even if he had not yet fully ventured into that terrain. But philosophy alone could not protect him where he was. Marx's writings against the state and religion, the critique of Hegel's philosophy of the state, and his essay on the Jewish question, faced heavy suspicion. In the eyes of German authorities, his conclusions crossed the line into political provocation. His criticism of religion was seen as an offense against stability, and his arguments about the state were seen as an attack on its legitimacy. It soon became impossible for him to stay in Germany. Not only intellectually, but also physically, Marx found that the walls were closing in. He had to leave. His journey took him into exile, heading for Paris. Exile was a risk, but it broadened his perspective. Paris was not merely another city. It was the gathering place of radical thinkers, the hum of printing presses, the pulse of workers' movements, and a society already shaped by industrial change. For someone seeking to understand human alienation, not as abstract theory, but as lived experience, Paris offered contact with evidence that no lecture hall could provide. Feuerbach's challenge, then, was both a spark and a limit. It taught Marx that human ideals were rooted in human life, but it stopped short of full recognition. Marx desired more. He aimed to explain why those ideals assumed alien forms, how estrangement was woven into labor, and what it would mean to transform that. That desire for change, already pressing, carried with him beyond the border. In his next phase, philosophy would confront the harsher realities of exile, politics, and industry. And in the streets and circles of Paris, Marx would begin to see alienation not just as a reflection, but as a fact of everyday labor, molding lives at their most foundational level. Imagine stepping into Paris as a political exile. Pavements alive with conversation, cafes humming with debate, and print shops scattering radical pamphlets into the air like sparks. The atmosphere was charged, more like a forge than a classroom, and every corner bore reminders of change in motion. It was here that Marx found himself facing a new question. Philosophy and religion had already shaped his mind, but in Paris, another force pressed itself upon him with undeniable urgency: labor, not just as a concept, but as an everyday struggle whose results could be seen in workshops, factories, and on the faces of working men and women. It was during this period that Marx drafted what is now known as the Paris Manuscripts of 1844. These were not finished works meant for readers or publication. In fact, Marx abandoned them before ever completing or releasing them. Instead, they survive as rough notebooks, more like sketches than books, a space for trial and error thinking rather than polished theory. Yet in these pages, we see him grappling directly with economic life, questioning how wages, effort, and human development are all interconnected. No longer was alienation merely about ideas or faith. These manuscripts marked his initial attempt to incorporate it into the machinery of modern production. At the same time, another influence arrived that would prove just as vital: his friendship with Friedrich Engels. Engels had a sharper analytical style and, importantly, a stronger sense of empirical reality. Where Marx leaned toward abstraction, Engels had already seen conditions in England's manufacturing cities firsthand, observing the dirt, hunger, and endless repetition of factory life. His reports were clear, forceful, and rooted in lived detail. Together, the contrast between them became productive. Engels' precision and eye for facts grounded Marx's developing theories, forcing them back again and again to the hard surface of what workers actually endured. Their discussions provided Marx with a bridge from speculation to evidence, marking the beginning of one of the most influential intellectual partnerships in history. This shift began to weaken Marx's dependence on philosophy alone as his primary means of analysis. What Hegel had once presented in grand dialectics, the streets of Paris now challenged with new realities. The categories of contradiction and estrangement could no longer stay just in ideas. They had to explain conditions in the factory and the workshop. Workers produced goods over which they had no control. Hours of life became objects, but those objects immediately slipped out of their reach into the hands of employers and markets. For Marx, this was not just a passing indignity. It revealed a fundamental truth about capitalism itself. He named it after philosophy, but made it clearer through observation: alienation. Marx described alienation not as a single feeling, but as something with multiple layers. Think of them as four facets of the same issue, each revealing a different perspective of estranged labor. The first was alienation from the product. A worker might sew clothing or assemble tools, yet once finished, the product was no longer theirs. It entered circulation as the property of someone else, enriching others. The paradox became clear. The more the worker produced, the less they themselves possessed. The second form was alienation from the very act of labor. Work did not manifest as free self-expression. It was commanded, timed, and measured. Instead of choice, there was coercion. Tasks became repetitive and mechanical. In this way, labor ceased to affirm the worker's individuality. It dulled it. Third was alienation from humanity itself, what Marx called species being, the characteristic human trait of shaping the world through conscious creation. The ability to imagine, design, and make was for him what made humans unique. But under capitalism, this essence diminished. Work became about survival, not growth. Creativity was reduced to monotonous chores. The worker was severed from what made them most human. The fourth was alienation from others. Labor in a capitalist system did not unite workers in a shared purpose. Instead, wages put them in competition. Jobs became scarce prizes, and ownership kept most excluded. Market exchange fractured cooperation into suspicion and reliance. Bonds between people that might have grown through collective creation instead dissolved into rivalry. To unify these four aspects, Marx sometimes compared them to artistic labor. Picture a painter at a canvas. Their creation stays with them. The act combines skill with choice, they develop their abilities, and they can share the finished work with others. Now picture a factory worker. The product disappears into someone else's pocket. The steps are dictated by routine. Their power of creation is limited, and those around them do not form a genuine community, but competitors within the same struggle. The difference is not a matter of temperament, but of structure, and it was this difference Marx called alienation. These insights changed the way he previously perceived puzzles. Religion, once at the heart of Feuerbach's critique, now seemed merely an echo to Marx. People prayed to gods that symbolized alien powers, but gods existed in their minds because external existence was already alien. Labor alienated them before ideas fully formed the picture. Religion was a superficial symptom. Its roots extended into the economic system itself. Even so, the Paris manuscripts remained precisely that, manuscripts. They were notes that trailed off, sketches never fully completed. Marx himself set them aside, later revisiting these issues from different angles. But their significance lies in showing the shift. Instead of asking what created religious images, he was now questioning what produced alienated lives. Humanity's problems were social and economic before they were theological. The consequence of this pivot was significant. If you accept that alienation stems from labor's organization, then criticism aimed at religion or philosophy cannot resolve it. The issue is less about interpretation and more about practice, about reshaping the conditions of labor that structure life itself. The move here was subtle yet decisive. Ideas must be translated into action. Paris marked a pivotal moment in Marx's journey. Surrounded by fellow radicals, guided by Engels's clarity, and daily confronted by industrial hardships, Marx moved from viewing estrangement as a misconception to understanding it as rooted in material relations. Though still incomplete, his notebooks laid out the foundation of alienated labor that would shape every subsequent stage of his thought. What emerged from these explorations was a realization that insight alone was not enough. Naming alienation explained something, but resolving alienation required action. And it was here, from the perspective of exile and theory intertwined with reality, that Marx began to move towards a new standard. Truth could not only be interpreted, it had to be lived in practice. What if truth were not something waiting to be discovered, but something shaped through human effort itself? This was the challenge Marx posed after years of wrestling with philosophy. He had questioned religion, argued with Feuerbach's naturalism, and written notes on alienation in economic life. But the decisive turn came with a short, unfinished series of reflections known as the Theses on Feuerbach. Marx never published them, partly because they struck him as too voluntaristic, leaning heavily on human will in a way that unsettled his broader project. Still, in their brevity, they captured a crucial leap, the conviction that philosophy could not stop at interpretation. It had to connect directly to action, to the transformation carried out in social life. What gave this moment its sharpness was the point of departure. Feuerbach had done significant work in grounding philosophy in material existence instead of abstract idealism. He showed how ideas like God were projections of human needs. Yet for Marx, this was not enough. Feuerbach's materialism made humans appear as passive creatures, defined by needs they merely projected outward. Marx insisted that human beings were not simply reflections of their circumstances. They were agents. To overlook this was to miss the fact that people remake their conditions through labor and struggle. That realization drew a line between philosophy that explained the world as it stood and a philosophy that invited participation in shaping what came next. An analogy clarifies the contrast. Imagine being given a detailed map showing rivers, roads, and mountains. You could study it carefully, memorizing every detail, but the map itself would not change your position. Only setting out, only walking the path, alters where you stand. Feuerbach's naturalism was like the map, descriptive, valuable, but stationary. Marx's turn to praxis was akin to a journey. It required movement, decisions, and steps that transformed both the traveler and the landscape itself. To regard humans as practical, then, was to see them not merely as thinkers, but as beings who live by working, producing, organizing, and struggling together. The theses emphasize this point with notable bluntness. They dismiss the idea of human essence as an abstract blueprint independent of activity. Instead, they argue that this essence manifests in practice through social labor, cooperation, conflict, and the networks of life that evolve with history. A person is not fixed once and for all. They are shaped and reshaped by their actions alongside others within the conditions they inherit. That explains why Marx argued that a critique limited to books or theories could never be enough. You might analyze religion or describe how alienation operates within an economic system, but unless those insights fed back into real structures, they remained incomplete. Genuine change required praxis, combining understanding with action. The demand was radical but straightforward. Knowledge had to demonstrate itself in transforming the conditions of life. If ideas never moved from the page into the organization of collective struggle, they withered. Their real meaning was only realized when tested through action. This did not mean Marx dismissed analysis or interpretation. On the contrary, he had absorbed from philosophy a methodical confidence in identifying contradictions, in building concepts, and in debating rigorously. That remained necessary. However, analysis was no longer sufficient on its own. To be meaningful, it had to be directed towards change, such as workers organizing, communities resisting, and people refusing to accept conditions as inevitable. Praxis, unlike commentary, linked ideas to processes that advanced history. From this perspective, the theses are larger than their parts. They serve as a bridge between Marx's early focus on alienation and his later analysis of exploitation. They connect the Paris manuscript's examination of estrangement with the extensive project of Capital. Without praxis, this link would be unclear. These notes introduced a philosophy that refused to drift away from events and instead insisted on being measured against collective experience. Their resilience stems from this refusal. They argue that thinking should not hover above the world, but engage with it directly. This shift, also changed Marx's idea of freedom. If human essence is activity rather than a fixed nature, then freedom is not just the absence of restraint. True freedom means the ability to help shape shared life. That means labor and its conditions are fundamental. Only when people control the structures of labor can their creative skills grow. Liberation, then, was never only about removing restrictions. It was about reorganizing the foundation on which life is built. Philosophy that ends with only description failed to understand how freedom must be made. Here we see Marx decisively distancing himself from earlier thinkers. Feuerbach highlighted how ideas could be projections, but Marx questioned what actions could initially eliminate the need for such predictions. While philosophy often regarded itself as above the world, Marx brought it down to street level, placing philosophers among the actors of history. They were not merely spectators, but active participants, responsible for aligning their thoughts with their practices. The concise form of the theses can make their impact easy to overlook. Unlike the lengthy treatises of Hegel or Kant, Marx's notes are succinct, yet their brevity is their strength. Each line conveys clarity, signaling a shift from passivity to action, from contemplation to engagement. If earlier philosophy acted like a mirror reflecting the world, these sentences turned the mirror back and asked, "What will you build?" This idea also challenged the traditional view of truth. Instead of being a timeless discovery, truth became something tested through practice and experience. An idea gained strength not by elegance on paper, but by proving useful in changing circumstances. Failed attempts were not merely errors. They were part of the process through which truth developed. For Marx, concepts lived or died, depending on whether they helped movements achieve liberation. The theses sounded less like a philosopher's commentary and more like instructions for how to measure knowledge against reality. And so, with these 11 fragments, Marx renewed his project to transform theory from mere interpretation into a guide for struggle. They show him no longer dwelling in the realm of passive explanation, but insisting that thought itself become active. In this, he remains both a philosopher and a critic of philosophy's limits. From this point onward, ideas would be judged not only by their coherence, but also by their capacity to act. This reorientation laid the foundation for what followed. Having embraced Praxis as the basis of truth, Marx and Engels soon faced a challenging task: to craft a statement that could energize a movement, a text that combined analysis with guidance. The question was whether such a statement, written under tremendous pressure and at impressive speed, could bear the weight of centuries. The pressure to act, not just interpret, soon manifested as a text demanded under urgent circumstances, a pamphlet written in just 1 week. In early 1848, as Europe trembled with unrest, Marx and Engels sat down to draft the manifesto of the Communist Party. Within days, they produced one of the most influential political works of modern times. It was concise, pointed, and portable, designed to be carried, translated, and quickly passed from person to person. For them, it was not merely a pamphlet, but the distilled result of years of debate now compressed into public speech. The rush behind it did not impede the writing. Instead, urgency sharpened it into something sharp and compelling. The setting was anything but calm. Europe simmered with labor strikes, food shortages, and political unrest. Monarchies faltered under pressure. Radical groups grew restless, and rumors of revolt spread as quickly as the print of newspapers. Amid this turbulence, Marx and Engels were tasked by their organization to produce a declaration, something that could outline the core of the socialist position, differentiate it from rivals, and point to a potential future. The demand came with no luxury of time. Within a week, they completed the draft. Compressed into this moment of upheaval, the pamphlet became a text balancing theory and direct appeal, written with the awareness that events might erupt at any moment. Its scope raises an obvious question. How can such brevity claim to explain world history and the direction of society? The answer lies not in the details, but in the framing. The manifesto sketches history as a sequence of class struggles, each epoch characterized by opposition between dominant and subordinate groups. Kings and courts are set aside as surface content. The focus shifts instead to deeper economic forces. That choice offers readers a different perspective, one that simplifies complexity into a radical story of continuity and conflict. It provides a lens through which to interpret not just Europe in turmoil, but human history itself. Yet, here, one nuance deserves attention. The famous line, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle," conveys an unforgettable simplicity. However, Marx himself later judged this claim to be overstated. His mature theory of exploitation, developed in Capital, applied specifically to capitalism. In pre-capitalist formations, such as feudalism or slave-based systems, the dynamics differed. Exploitation persisted, but not in the same structural form described in the manifesto. In retrospect, the sweeping claim was too broad, both empirically and within the context of Marx's developing theory. Nonetheless, its impact at the time relied less on technical accuracy than on the powerful vision it presented. That beneath politics and religion, there lies a deeper rhythm of conflict driven by material life. At the center of this vision was the bourgeoisie. Unlike older ruling classes, they did not preserve old orders, but dismantled them. They thrived not by maintaining tradition, but by overturning it, driving continual revolutions in production. Cities expanded, industries emerged, and entire social structures shifted in response to their influence. Whereas aristocracies had preserved inherited titles, this new class gained power through markets, trade, and capital. They were modernizers, but in ways that destabilized everything around them. The manifesto emphasized their dynamism with particular force. To survive, the bourgeoisie had to constantly revolutionize production, never to rest, never to pause. That imperative drove continuous technological change. Factories, railways, global trade, and the rapid development of new markets. Such progress seemed both exhilarating and terrifying at times. Each step forward also sparked new crises. As markets expanded and collapsed, workers were recruited and discarded, and entire ways of life were eroded. The class that appeared strongest was also destined for instability, caught in a cycle of change that had no end but exhaustion. This double image of builders and destroyers energized the text. It offered sympathy for the achievements of the bourgeoisie, while insisting that those same achievements contained the seeds of their own collapse. By showing creation and destruction in one motion, Marx and Engels framed capitalism not as a system of stability, but as one of contradiction. It was this telescopic view, pulled back far enough to capture both wonder and fragility, that gave the pamphlet its distinctive charge. Form and style were equally important. The manifesto avoided complex abstractions. Instead, it used vivid imagery, family ties dissolving in markets, belief hollowed out by trade, identities reshaped through the pressure to work and compete. These images distilled arguments into memorable lines that could be shared both orally and in print. In an era when texts were read aloud to groups, such conciseness made every phrase portable. Few pamphlets managed to combine such density with clarity. That blend ensured longevity, whereas bulkier works risked being forgotten. From there, the focus shifted to the proletariat, the class created by industrial capitalism itself. Workers in factories and mines, dispossessed of land and tools, faced conditions of alienation. Yet their forced concentration also gave them strength. Unlike scattered peasants, industrial workers gathered daily, unintentionally trained in cooperation by the rhythms of machinery. The very system that stripped them of individuality also fostered their potential collective power. What once seemed only as estrangement now indicated latent solidarity. The idea that misery could generate its own organized resistance was central to the argument. The text introduced programmatic demands. It outlined measures, adjustments to taxation, education, and property, intended as stepping stones to achieve its goals. These were not blueprints for an entire society, but framing signals, concrete enough to seem practical, broad enough for adaptation across countries. For audiences disillusioned with outline debates, this grounding provided the pamphlet with pragmatic weight. It presented itself not as fantasy, but as actionable guidance. Still, the paradox remained. How could a class both ingenious and indispensable also be declared doomed? Marx and Engels addressed this through the concept of contradiction. The bourgeoisie had indeed developed productive forces to heights never before seen. But by turning labor into wage work, separated from its product, they created antagonisms that were impossible to sustain forever. Growth generated a crisis. Control birthed resistance. Their success laid the groundwork for its opposite. For readers, it offered both an explanation of the present and a doorway into imagining something different. The endurance of the manifesto resides in this open framework. It was not a prophecy bound to specific dates, but a tool for interpretation. Later generations, faced with different circumstances, revisited it as a way of connecting their struggles to broader processes. Its continuity did not rely on fixed accuracy, but on providing a method to view society as constantly shifting under the weight of its own contradictions. What enabled such compression was discipline born of long preparation. Years of drafts, debate, and publication had refined the arguments in advance. When the hour came, speed produced clarity. Stripped of digressions, honed to essentials, the text gained a force that larger works lacked. Urgency became precision, and precision became power. That is why this brief document stood out among the volumes of its time, and why it remains read while others gather dust on library shelves. A pamphlet barely longer than a chapter became a lasting political text. Its quick creation gave it purpose. Its portrayals of capitalism and class struggle resonated not only with its immediate context, but also with many future moments. Its blending of simplicity and breadth signified a shift in Marx's development, from his notebooks of thought to active interventions in history. What followed, however, demonstrated how vulnerable even the most precise words could be when challenged by reality. The struggles it helped prompt quickly spilt into the streets, and one brief experiment would significantly influence Marx's view of revolution itself. When workers in Paris seized control of their city in 1871, the moment was brief, but unforgettable. For weeks, they built institutions that tested ideas long confined to theory. This was the Paris Commune, an attempt at a politics where working people themselves held power. Its existence was short, but for Marx, the impact was lasting. Here was living proof that ordinary men and women could govern directly, and through its brutal destruction, a stark reminder of what opposed them. The Commune emerged in a vacuum of authority. Paris, weakened and isolated after war and crisis, separated itself from the central state. Citizens, many of whom were artisans and laborers, gathered a council of their own creation. Representatives were chosen directly from neighborhoods and workplaces, made accountable through strict oversight, and significantly subject to recall by those who elected them. Authority was not granted once and for all, but maintained based on ongoing trust. This principle of accountability presented a radical contrast to the distant rule of traditional elites. The Commune's design demonstrated that government could be closely connected to the people it claimed to serve. For a brief period, Paris lived under rules it had created for itself. Policies addressed the pressures of siege and poverty. Housing rents suspended during the war were canceled, easing burdens on families. Factories and workshops abandoned by owners were discussed as potential cooperatives. Soldiers of the official army were dismissed within the city and replaced by a people's guard. Religious institutions were sharply restricted in influence, separating faith from public authority. Most of these measures were implemented cautiously and incompletely, but together they signaled an intention to change not just leadership, but the very foundations of social life. For Marx, this was the closest he had yet seen to the working class acting as its own authority. This mattered because it addressed a question that had long lurked beneath his writing. Could the working class act as more than just a force of protest? Could it truly govern? In Paris, the answer became visible. Citizens who had once seemed defeated by hardship began organizing laws, managing institutions, and making claims on the structure of society. It was practice replacing speculation. The Commune demonstrated that power could shift into new hands even. Its end came suddenly. The French state, regrouped and supported by Allied powers, launched an attack with overwhelming force. In the ensuing fighting, the Commune collapsed. Thousands of its supporters were killed or imprisoned. Streets that had witnessed experiment swiftly turned into sites of repression. For critics, this was confirmation that such utopian ventures could never last. For Marx, the meaning ran deeper. The Commune had both demonstrated capability and exposed vulnerability. Workers had proven themselves capable of governing, but ruling classes proved just as willing to destroy them without limit. This dual outcome compelled Marx to reconsider revolution more critically. On one hand, he celebrated the Commune as the first instance of what he later called the dictatorship of the proletariat, ruled by workers for their own benefit. On the other hand, he warned that enthusiasm and courage alone were insufficient. Modern states possess armies, resources, and power networks that no local uprising could disregard. To endure, it would require strategy, organization, and preparation far beyond what Paris managed. The Commune, while inspiring, showed the deadly cost of engaging in such a struggle without the means to defend it. The significance of the event also ignited intense debates among other revolutionaries, especially Mikhail Bakunin. Bakunin, an anarchist, believed that the Commune demonstrated the danger of any form of state power. To him, freedom entailed the complete abolition of the state. Politics should become local, voluntary, and free from hierarchy. Bakunin is an anarchist, as Marx's contemporaries described him. He believes in the ordinary people, and he wants to get rid of the state, rather than doing stuff by the state. From Bakunin's perspective, Marx placed too much trust in central political structures. His statism, as Bakunin's allies called it, represented a dangerous over-reliance on governing machinery. Marx examined the same episode but reached a different conclusion. He saw in the Commune not proof that all states must disappear immediately, but rather that they should be seized and reshaped. He argued that destroying central coordination guaranteed defeat, as Paris had demonstrated. The issue was not the organization itself, but who controlled it and for what purpose. The Commune's downfall, in his view, partly stemmed from its weak central defense. Workers could not rely solely on spontaneity. The state, although transformed, remained a necessary tool until new social conditions rendered it unnecessary altogether. This disagreement deepened divisions between Marxists and anarchists that would persist in later movements. Marx and Engels also regarded the Commune as an essential reference point for evaluating possibility and danger. Earlier, their writings often outlined broad historical stages, as if class conflict would occur like a series of acts on a theater stage. After 1871, their perspective shifted. They considered the practical forms revolt might take, the vulnerabilities that could lead to failure, and ways in which theory needed to adapt when confronted by force. The Commune served not as an abstraction, but as a concrete example, an event that enabled future revolutionaries to observe both potentials and limitations. The lessons touched on two extremes simultaneously. Supporters pointed to evidence that working people could govern, legislate, and endure hardship while maintaining order. Critics argued that once tested, these fragile structures collapsed under superior firepower. Marx maintained that both observations were valid. The Commune was a milestone of potential and a warning of vulnerability. It deserved admiration as well as critical analysis. Imagine a sketch turning into a prototype. A drawing indicates what might exist. A prototype reveals weaknesses under pressure. The Commune was the prototype of revolutionary theory. It showed possibilities never seen before, but also flaws never considered on paper. To Marx, its failure was more instructive than years of speculation. Theory had touched reality. Reality had responded harshly but usefully. These lessons influenced later writings, where Marx and Engels clarified their views on revolution, emphasizing the dual necessity of seizing power and maintaining it. No amount of goodwill or determination could protect a workers' government from repression without a robust organization. The lesson was stark but clear. Revolutions would not unfold peacefully on their own. Those seeking to overthrow entrenched powers had to expect resistance and prepare for it. In the aftermath, conflicts between revolutionary factions intensified. For anarchists, the Commune symbolized the promise of local autonomy free from central authority. For Marxists, it confirmed the need to utilize power structures until history rendered them unnecessary. Neither side silenced the other. Instead, the Commune deepened its divide, influencing disagreements that persisted long after its suppression. For Marx himself, the experience strengthened his conviction rather than weakened it. He remained confident that change must come through class struggle led by workers themselves, but he now saw more clearly how fragile success would be without systematic organization. His philosophy of revolution shifted from being a flight of imagination to a careful understanding of circumstances, limits, and dangers. If history were to change, it would be through struggle that is aware of the forces it is up against. In the years that followed, the Commune resonated through Marx's reflections as both an example and a cautionary tale. It demonstrated what could be achieved, however briefly. It also showed how fiercely it could be undone. More than any theory, this event rooted Marx in the understanding that social transformation requires both vision and resilient forms of collective power. and as he turned again to his unfinished work and fresh notes, he carried that awareness with him. The test of the Commune sharpened his search for a more rigorous science of society, one that could map not just possibilities, but pathways, stages, and structures of change. What if a thinker started to doubt the very path he had once mapped out for human history? Marx had often described the past as moving along a single route: primitive society giving way to slavery, slavery to feudalism, feudalism to capitalism, and so forth. But in 1857 to 58, he sat down to write what would later be called the Grundrisse, a massive 1,000-page collection of hurried, handwritten notes, drafted almost in a rush. This text was never intended for publication. It functioned more as a sketch or outline, a private workspace where Marx revisited the very story he had once narrated with such confidence. Instead of a polished roadmap, you find rough lines, crossings out, and explorations circling back on themselves, evidence of a thinker testing, doubting, and redrawing. The Grundrisse is best seen not as a finished work, but as Marx's sketchbook. Here, he permitted himself experiments, false starts, and sudden shifts of direction. Many passages feel provisional, as though he were debating with himself. You observe him circling a problem, reframe it, and sometimes revise assumptions he had previously deemed certain. Because it lacks polish, its value lies precisely in showing Marx in motion. The notes provide access to the intellectual workshop of a thinker, refining tools before confidently presenting them to the public. Earlier in his writings, Marx relied heavily on a unilinear view, history as a series of stages, each leading to the next, almost like gears in a machine. However, working through the Grundrisse taught him that the picture was less straightforward. Different societies did not follow identical paths. Some skipped stages. Others combined features of more than one. The more Marx studied early anthropology and looked beyond Europe, the more he saw these deviations increase. As a result, the certainty of one direct route dissolved. History branched, overlapped, and doubled back, creating a web of paths rather than a single track. This shift did more than complicate his historical framework. It also brought alienation back to the core of his thought. In the 1840s, alienation was a key theme. However, as Marx shifted towards economic analysis, he at times appeared to set it aside, as if it were shelved and incomplete. In the Grundrisse, alienation reemerges in a new context, no longer solely in religion or psychology, but now rooted in real relations of labor, ownership, and power. By integrating alienation into a study of how people are separated from their conditions of life, Marx combined his earlier philosophical concerns with the sharper tools of political economy. It is helpful to imagine the transformation as moving from a straight motorway to a network of paths. The motorway metaphor suggests everyone marches along the same road, passing fixed milestones. But in the Grundrisse, the map changes. Some routes loop or turn back, others intersect or branch. Societies could reach similar problems via very different routes. In a world becoming increasingly interconnected, this realization of complexity enabled Marx to think in broader terms. The story of Europe was not automatically the story of everywhere. Within this sketchbook, Marx began to examine what made capitalism unique among economic systems carefully. He argued that the defining feature was the separation of labor from the means of production. Capitalism forced people to sell their labor as a commodity precisely because they no longer controlled land, tools, or resources of their own. That split between human capacity and material needs explained why capitalism functioned differently from feudalism or slavery. It was not a matter of ideals or perceptions, but of structural arrangements. This clarity laid the foundation for a science of society capable of identifying necessary conditions, not just surface appearances. In earlier writings, alienation was described as a felt condition. The worker became estranged from their product, their activity, and their humanity. Emotion and experience dominated the account. In the Grundrisse, Marx began to shift the emphasis. Alienation was now rooted within observable structures. If the worker could only survive by selling their labor because they had been dispossessed of tools and land, alienation was not merely a feeling. It was built into the relations of production themselves. This adjustment was crucial. It shifted critique from moral language towards systematic explanation. By approaching society in this way, Marx moved closer to what he sometimes referred to as a science of society. He was not conducting experiments, but he was recognizing regularities and internal structures as scientists do when analyzing a living organism. The Grundrisse became his laboratory. Organs under scrutiny, functions compared, relations dissected. Instead of relying solely on philosophical critique, he now sought to discover consistent principles that explained how economies functioned. These notes also demonstrate that he considers time carefully. Revolutions were not immediate. They involved gradual technological changes that laid the foundation. Machines transformed work not just by replacing labor, but by altering its nature. Human skill became confined to narrow routines, while larger systems of capital investment absorbed and redirected energy. What workers lost as individual producers, machinery gained on behalf of capital. Even in the rough writings of the Grundrisse, you can already see the early stages of the later, more detailed analysis in Das Kapital. Ideas about machinery and surplus labor here are like seedlings waiting to develop. Reading through these notebooks today, what captivates scholars is their unfinished nature. Marx is not seen as an infallible authority, but rather as a thinker continually revising himself. In the Manifesto, he wrote clearly and powerfully about certainties. In the Grundrisse, he doubts, experiments, and often qualifies his statements. This makes him more human, less dogmatic. The Sketchbook challenges the stereotype of Marx as a rigidly deterministic thinker. Instead, he appears flexible and responsive, adjusting his views when new evidence emerges. It is within these drafts that Marx's gaze turned more clearly towards global diversity. He began to see how tribal property, communal arrangements, and different systems of agriculture led to very different pathways. The earlier assumption that Europe's feudal capitalist model would apply everywhere now seemed too limited. Societies could originate from other structures, adapt in various ways, and follow separate routes. Recognizing this meant complicating his theory, but also enriching it. The science of society had to explain diversity, not just uniformity. At the same time, the Grundrisse refined concepts Marx had long struggled to formalize. In the German ideology, one of his earlier collaborations, he grappled with the relationship between ideas and life. However, he lacked clear categories for how social systems were grounded. He did not yet have the term relations of production. That absence left gaps and confusion. In the Grundrisse, he began to name and stabilize this concept, relations of production, as the structured ties between people and the means of survival. Naming it provided the pivot that turned his work from early critiques into mature structural analysis. Viewed as a whole, the Grundrisse is neither a polished theory nor a finished work. It functions as a rehearsal, a sketchbook. Nonetheless, its importance cannot be overstated. For the first time, Marx explored practical questions about different development paths, the return of alienation as a structural element, and the central significance of relations of production. These notes changed his approach to society, from a single progression of stages to a complex web of histories, all governed by fundamental economic structures. This development prepared Marx for his most ambitious project. Testing ideas in private notes was one stage. However, the next challenge was to present that laboratory work within a systematic framework for the world to see. The question then shifted from whether history followed a single path to how, under capitalism, exploitation operated beneath the surface of wage and work. It was here, in the monumental project that followed, that Marx aimed to reveal precisely how a system that seems fair on the surface could still depend on hidden injustices. How can a wage that appears fair still hide exploitation? This was the challenge Marx chose to tackle in his most demanding work, Das Kapital, first published in 1867. Unlike the hurried pamphlets or manifestos that came before, this was dense, systematic, and structured like a science. He aimed to uncover not only the politics of capitalism, but also the precise mechanism that allowed profit to thrive beneath the facade of fairness. His goal was to demonstrate, step by step, how inequality was reproduced even through voluntary exchange. The puzzle begins with wages. On the surface, nothing seems hidden. A worker sells a set number of hours, the employer pays accordingly, and the contract appears balanced, consensual, even fair. But Marx asked a more complex question. If everything was perfectly balanced, how would there be profit at all? If employers always paid back exactly what workers produced, industries could not grow, and capital could not accumulate. The fact that wealth expanded so dramatically meant that something extra was being extracted. That surplus had to come from somewhere beyond the visible surface of wage exchange. To locate it, Marx revisited a debate already ongoing in economic thought: how goods acquire value. Earlier thinkers, such as John Locke, suggested that at least 90% of all value is derived from labor, famously illustrated by his image of water in a well. The effort of drawing it gave even simple water its value. Adam Smith took this further, asserting bluntly that all value is created by labor. Marx inherited these ideas, but radicalized them. He contended that labor was not merely a fundamental ingredient, but the primary dynamic source of new value. What earlier writers regarded as a principle, he rigorously defined as a theory of value itself. Marx drew a vital distinction between constant capital and variable capital. Constant capital consists of machines, tools, and raw materials. A loom or a hammer transmits its value into the products, but it contributes nothing beyond what it already has. It simply transfers value, much like pouring water from one bucket to another. Variable capital, however, refers to human labor power. Unlike objects, workers do not merely transfer value, they add it. By working on materials, they increase the amount of value within the system. That was the core of Marx's argument. Only living labor creates new value. From this point, Marx formalized his explanation with a straightforward equation. The value of any commodity is made up of C plus V plus S. C is constant capital, the tools and resources that are passed on. V is variable capital, the wages paid to workers, and S is surplus value, the unpaid portion of labor that is turned into profit. This simple formula summed up his entire analysis. The constant capital preserved value, the wage sustained the worker, but the surplus generated profit for the capitalist. Once understood this way, profit no longer seemed mysterious. It had a source: labor performed beyond the wage received. The next step was vital. Marx emphasized that we should differentiate between labor and labor power. Workers do not sell their actual labor, which only exists once performed. Instead, they sell their labor power, the ability to work for a specific period, through the wage contract. This subtle shift unlocked Marx's insight. Because labor power could produce more value than the wage necessary to support the worker, it created surplus value. Employers purchase the use of labor power at a low cost, but utilize it fully during the working day. That analytical breakthrough, separating labor from labor power, was what Marx saw as his key conceptual advancement. It explained why the wage relation, even when seemingly fair, always masked exploitation. You can think of it like a mill grinding grain. One portion of grain is poured in, but what comes out the other side is larger than the input. Wages only cover the cost of the grain poured in, the minimum needed for the worker's survival, while the labor involved produces more value than that. The excess is quietly siphoned off as profit. The transaction appears balanced, but the difference between the value created and the value returned is the hidden core of exploitation. This transformed how exploitation was understood. For centuries, it was viewed as underpayment, cheating, or outright corruption. Marx contended it persisted even when employers offered fair contracts. Exploitation was not accidental misconduct. It was a consequence of the very structure of wage labor. As long as people were compelled to sell labor power because they owned no means of production, surplus value would arise and be appropriated. The wage relationship was not a remedy for injustice, but rather a mechanism through which injustice perpetuated itself. That realization also linked exploitation to alienation, but with a sharper focus. In his earlier writings in Paris, alienation was felt as estrangement. Workers felt disconnected from their products and themselves. In Das Kapital, Marx explained why the product was alien, not only because another owned it, but also because it represented unpaid labor. Every object carried a piece of human life that the worker never got back. Alienation was now quantifiable through surplus value, changing from a feeling into a fundamental law of production. From this point, the analysis broadened. Since profit stems solely from surplus labor, capitalists had every motivation to extract as much value as possible. This involved extending the working day, intensifying work, or replacing labor with machinery that boosted productivity. However, while machinery increased output, it reduced the proportion of labor relative to investment. This created contradictions. More advanced production raised overall output, but also diminished the very source of surplus value, leading to cycles of boom and bust. The constant drive of capitalism to grow, innovate, and displace resulted from its reliance on surplus labor. You begin to see the pattern Marx was revealing. Wages and contracts mask inequality by making exchange seem equal. Workers perceive labor as being traded for money. Employers see it as an investment yielding profit. Neither notices the disparity between value created and value received in everyday appearances. The illusion of fairness is maintained by the very categories: price, wage, contract, exchange, each of which conceals as much as it reveals. For readers, this scientific precision was demanding. The pages are technical, full of definitions and categories that require patience and attention. Yet the reward was striking. At the end of the analysis, the mechanism was precise. Not corruption, but ordinary contracts explained how profit arose. The more the system appeared consensual, the more deeply it concealed exploitation. This framework also transformed moral critique into a measurable process. Alienation describes a sense of estrangement. Exploitation outlined the arithmetic of loss, the division between paid and unpaid labor. It uncovered exploitation as the driving force behind capitalism, fueling its growth, crises, and conflicts. If the market were a machine, surplus value was the hidden engine, constantly at work. That is why Das Kapital became the foundation of Marx's work. It shifted his critique from focusing on alienation and moral disconnection to analyzing the structure of exploitation, expressed through formulas and mechanisms. Capitalism no longer appeared as a fair exchange tainted by occasional abuses, but as a coherent system designed to generate surplus design. This realization lays the groundwork for understanding the broader narrative. What initially appeared as estrangement in early manuscripts was formalized in theories of surplus value. Over decades, Marx transitioned from philosophy to political economy, from critiquing feelings to analyzing law. Throughout this process, you can observe the connection between alienation and exploitation, the emotional and the structural, as two aspects of the same evolving process. How did Marx transition from describing estrangement in human life to formulating a structural law about society itself? This shift from alienation to exploitation became the defining move of his intellectual journey. In the 1840s, alienation shaped his critique. He demonstrated how workers were disconnected from their products, from the act of labor, from their humanity, and from each other. It was moral, existential, and immediately understandable. But by the mid-1860s, Marx was seeking something more precise. He aimed to uncover why this estrangement happened, why it recurred across industries, and why it persisted even when wages seemed fair. That pursuit led him to develop a theory of exploitation, no longer a feeling, but a structural law embedded in the very functioning of capitalism. The transition signifies a change in approach. Alienation evoked imagination and empathy. You can easily envision a worker constructing a chair they cannot afford to own, or clocking endless hours on a factory line where creativity disintegrates into routine. Alienation provoked the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. Yet, defenders of capitalism could dismiss such observations as subjective impressions, a matter of envy or emotion. Exploitation, however, aimed to demonstrate that unfairness was not simply perception, but a mechanism. It argued that the fundamental process of wage labor itself caused the imbalance, regardless of how anyone felt about it. Alienation shows the surface, while exploitation uncovers the process. Imagine a doctor first encountering symptoms: fatigue, pain, confusion. That is alienation, the visible signs of estrangement. Now, picture the doctor examining the cause, detecting the infection, pinpointing the condition, revealing its pattern. That is exploitation in Marx's terms, the concealed process through which surplus value arises. Once understood, surplus value clarifies why alienation is a constant presence under capitalism. Estrangement is not a moral lapse, but an expected outcome of how labor is organized. This development refined Marx's earlier insights without erasing them. Alienation remained part of his vocabulary, yet his focus narrowed to mechanics. It was like redrawing an outline into a blueprint. The figures were recognizable, but every detail was sharpened. Early descriptions captured what alienation felt like. Later analysis demonstrated mathematically how labor produced more value than it returned, and why this difference persisted regardless of the context. Exploitation was not sentiment, but structure. In his early years, Marx was what later scholars referred to as the Hegelian Marx. Alienation dominated his reflections, and he drew his tools from philosophy. He was not yet a historical materialist. However, after years of exile, the harsh defeat of revolutionary hopes during the Commune, and months spent writing in notebooks like the Grundrisse, his perspective underwent a fundamental change. He began to work as a materialist economist, examining categories through production and exchange, rather than solely through consciousness. This intellectual shift was crucial. It moved him from philosophical criticism to analyzing structural laws. With that transformation, exploitation became the central concept of what later became his mature theory. By the time Marx wrote Das Kapital, the framework had solidified into clear categories. Value was measured in labor time, capital was divided into constant and variable components, and surplus value represented the difference between the labor performed and the wages paid. Constant capital, machines, raw materials, transferred value, but did not produce anything new. Variable capital, living labor power, created new value, but only part of it was returned to the worker. The rest, the surplus, drove capitalist growth. Exploitation was simply the ordinary exchange of labor power hidden within contracts that appeared balanced, but were not. Alienation and exploitation, then, form two interconnected aspects of the same reality. Alienation describes the experience, the feeling of disconnection, the monotony of uncreative labor, the sense of being reduced to a machine. Exploitation explains the repetition, why surplus value is continually extracted, and why workers are always expected to produce more than they receive in return. What had seemed like philosophy in the 1840s became, by the 1860s, the science of capital's reproduction. This methodological shift was significant. Critics of alienation could dismiss it as a mood or a perspective. However, exploitation, as surplus value, is claimed to possess objective validity, similar to a law of motion. Even if workers did not feel estranged, they remained exploited because the wage system always concealed unpaid labor. Marx aimed to establish credibility by shifting the critique to this level of rigor. The move made criticism harder to dismiss and compelled readers to recognize exploitation as systemic, not incidental. However, Marx's discipline lay in how he linked the two. He did not discard alienation. He clarified why it developed. Alienation countered abstraction by naming the common misery of work. Exploitation charted the mechanics that ensured its persistence. Together, the two ideas gave his thought both depth and structure, as well as moral urgency and analytical clarity. A reader could sense one side while exploring the other. That combination is partly why his critique has endured. An analogy might help clarify this. Imagine adjusting a blurry lens. At first, shapes seem distorted. Colors appear unbalanced. That is alienation, the feeling that something is wrong with what you see. But then, you recalibrate the lens and recognize the cause of the distortion within the glass itself. That is exploitation, the structure that ensures the distortion will always occur. In this way, Marx shifted the critique from merely observing misery to explaining its underlying causes and necessity. One consequence was stylistic. The Paris manuscripts read almost like essays of reflection, fragments about religion, species being, and estrangement. Das Kapital, by contrast, unfolds like a manual of categories: constant and variable capital, absolute and relative surplus value, diagrams for how value flows through circulation. The textures are different, but when read together, you can see the same thinker tightening his grip. He traded flourish for system, imagery, for law, precisely to reveal exploitation, not only as injustice, but as a predictable process. At the most fundamental level, exploitation altered how each aspect of capitalism was perceived. Wages no longer represented fairness, but served as tools of concealment. Markets no longer symbolized freedom, but implied hidden coercion. Alienation reflected the human side of this, what life felt like under such a system. Exploitation identified the underlying calculations. Together, they presented a single argument. Capitalism's outward fairness masked a system of extraction that converted human time into profit. Later thinkers recognized the power of this structural framing and built upon it. Georg Lukács, for instance, wrote about reified consciousness. He referred to the tendency for people to see human-made constructs as if they were natural laws, unchangeable and objective. Wage labor, profit, and competition start to seem as if they are second nature, with the same inevitability as gravity. However, they were not forces of nature at all. They were social relations created by humans. For Lukács, Marx's analysis of exploitation revealed this reification. By exposing surplus value, Marx demonstrated that what appeared to be eternal facts of life were actually products of a specific system, and therefore open to change. In this context, the shift from alienation to exploitation offered more than a simple critique of capitalism. It pointed towards a potential science of society, where mechanisms could be examined, laws uncovered, and illusions dismantled. Capitalism could no longer be regarded as a timeless truth. Instead, it was demonstrated as a historical formation, governed by its own rules and contradictions, reliant on the extraction of labor. Like all human systems, it could be understood, challenged, and ultimately transformed. Seen across the entire arc, Marx's project shifts from highlighting estrangement to demonstrating structure. It begins with the lived reality of alienation and develops into a systematic account of exploitation. This journey enables him to speak to both human experience and institutional design, addressing both the personal lives of workers and the impersonal mechanisms of capital. It is this combination that gives his critique both warmth and rigor. But stepping back, another comparison might help situate Marx's achievement within a broader context. His work was revolutionary in content, but it was also scientific in its aim. He was trying to do for society what others had started doing for the natural world, to discover the hidden forces that influence what we see and to explain them systematically. This ambition then raises the following question: why have some compared him to the most outstanding scientist of his era? Why would anyone compare the author of Das Kapital to a natural scientist like Charles Darwin? At first, the two seemed to belong in different worlds. Darwin studied the gradual adaptation of plants and animals. Marx examined factories, markets, and the evolving struggles of human society. Yet both men sought to uncover the hidden forces that shape systems that appear chaotic on the surface. Darwin revealed variation and natural selection. Marx exposed the dynamics of class conflict and the production process. Each devised a framework that transformed how people understood not just individual cases, but the entire pattern of life or society. Interestingly, Marx respected this parallel so much that, for a time, he even contemplated dedicating Das Kapital to Darwin. This alone demonstrates how much he regarded his own method as being in continuity with the science of his era. Darwin's brilliance was in explaining the richness of living forms without relying on fixed design. nature's diversity could emerge from variation and selection acting over time. Similarly, Marx refused to interpret history through timeless truths about justice or destiny. Instead, he argued that the driving force lay in material processes, how people organized production, and how those arrangements generated conflict. Both men removed myth and replaced it with naturalistic explanations. They both maintained that, upon observation, surface diversity concealed deeper laws, and these laws could be examined systematically. For Marx, the shift meant emphasizing that rulers or philosophers did not primarily drive societies. Instead, they were shaped by the conditions through which ordinary people secured their livelihoods: food, shelter, clothing, and the organization of work. These fundamentals grounded politics and culture. Just as Darwin demonstrated that hidden forces explained the diversity of organisms known at the time, Marx argued that social facts, such as jobs, wages, and prices, were part of a larger system. Farmers, merchants, and workers did not need to be told what labor and exchange were. What Marx proposed was the idea that these visible practices only made sense when understood as symptoms of a deeper mechanism of class conflict and surplus extraction. Here, the comparison deepens. Darwin was accused of fatalism. Did natural selection mean living beings had no freedom at all, just mechanical survival? Critics of Marx asked the same. Did his account of history reduce people to puppets? If economics were everything, where was space for choice or creativity? The suspicion was that Marx had built a vision so mechanistic that it squeezed out human agency. But Marx resisted that. He argued that his view was not mechanical determinism, but rather the recognition of structural pressures. People did make history, but within conditions not of their choosing. Think of it as playing on a tilted board. The slope influences how a ball rolls. However, the way you push or strike it still matters. For Marx, the structures of production set the slope. They give action a tendency, steer events in likely directions, and load the board with contradictions. Employers seek profit, workers seek relief. Both meet on terrain that tilts towards conflict. Within that framework, humans will still matter. Marx understood that revolutionary activity was significant. His model was dynamic. Pressures arise from contradictions, and change occurs because people act on these pressures. He was never a strict determinist. At every point, he linked theory back to praxis, the idea he argued earlier that makes philosophy real. You can observe this dynamism in his manuscripts. He constantly revisited drafts, revised and tested concepts. In the Grundrisse, he explored whether history followed a single linear path or multiple ones. In Das Kapital, he repeatedly defined categories until they became precise and well-defined. His approach was more restless than static. Unlike ideologues who froze their systems, Marx adapted his as he incorporated new evidence. This makes the comparison to Darwin even more apt. Both sought frameworks grounded in observation, willing to change with new data, rather than relying on declarations based on authority. This attitude propelled modern social science in a way it had not experienced before. Once Marx published, scholars could no longer discuss politics and law as if they were separate from labor and property. The questions of who controlled production and who gained from it became unavoidable. Even critics rejecting Marx's conclusions had to reconsider their arguments in light of his framework. Just as Darwin's idea of adaptation became impossible to ignore in biology, Marx's concepts of class and exploitation became unavoidable in social debates. Whether you agreed or not, the framework changed the vocabulary. Both men showed discipline in rejecting prophecy. Darwin admitted in later writings that his initial sketch of evolution was overly simple. As his research progressed, complexity increased. Marx also did not treat earlier notes as final. He dismissed the linear model of stages he once supported, allowing for multiple pathways of development. He examined events like the Paris Commune and adjusted his theory of revolution accordingly. What matters is not certainty, but method. Neither theory is treated as final. Both recognized that systems, once studied, require revision. This is also why Marx's work continues to resonate. When debates today return to issues such as rising inequality, stagnant wages, or the gap between productivity and pay, they do so in terms outlined by Marx. Economists might argue about measurements, politicians may disagree over policy, but the core categories of who owns, who works, and who claims the surplus remain in play because Marx once defined them. Similarly, biology broadens and occasionally disputes details of evolution, yet Darwin's framework of natural selection remains intact. Such foundations endure precisely because they reshape how questions are asked. It is tempting to confine both figures within their century, yet it is more accurate to view them as the beginning of traditions that expanded far beyond them. Darwin's lineage is reflected in genetics, ecology, and evolutionary psychology. Marx's lineage extends through sociology, critical economics, political science, and theories of globalization. Their influence does not depend on complete agreement. It relies on having compelled entire fields to explore new depths where previously only surface facts were visible. The misunderstanding of determinism is worth revisiting. Marx's analysis emphasized that you could not ignore the forces driving society forward. However, he viewed these not as inevitable chains, but as contradictions that created opportunities. Employers sought profit, workers resisted long hours, markets fostered expansion, but also crises. From this unrest emerged the potential for decision. Freedom did not disappear. It transformed into a choice made under pressure. Far from predicting resignation, Marx continually returned to action as the key through which outcomes could diverge. The tension between necessity and freedom was a constant presence. His framework argued that both were present, and history was the result of their intertwined movement. Calling Marx the Darwin of social science does not blur the difference between biology and politics. Instead, it highlights three common approaches. Both revealed hidden systems behind apparent chaos. Both replaced myth with observable and testable naturalistic processes, and both left questions that extended beyond their own writings, pushing future generations to refine and expand their ideas. Darwin made life dynamic through the process of natural selection. Marx made society dynamic through production and class conflict. What endures in Marx's achievement is not prediction, but orientation. He urged readers to ask, what structures shape our societies? What contradictions strain against them? And what capacity for action do humans still possess within them? To frame these questions was in itself a contribution to knowledge. It also leads to a broader realization. Marx's thought was never solely about theories written on a page. It was always about the friction between the categories people imagine and the conditions they endure. That tension remains, and it is where his legacy continues to challenge each of us. Marx's story concludes not with doctrine, but with a perspective on how to view society. His main insight was that ideas and lived experiences cannot be separated. Alienation and exploitation are not incidental. They are embedded in the patterns of labor, property, and exchange that shape daily life. Consider this in your own world. The time you work for wages, the products or services that pass from your hands without return. These patterns reflect the dynamics Marx aimed to uncover.